I was in that position. I had my son, but let me tell you, there's women that make the other choice that are just as torn up. And then they have to go out and face a public, a group of people that don't believe the way they believe and called every name in the book. Who wants that?
No one.
We want better for our children and people in the world. And there's no easy answer, but making it a freaking political football and name calling and chastising and all that is unforgivable to me and is the most unchristian thing you can do to someone.
Welcome to the East Anchorage Book Club. I'm your host, Andrew Gray. The purpose of this podcast is to tell the stories of Alaskans of interest and importance. Today on the show, we have former Alaska State House Majority Leader Charisse Millett. We discuss her childhood with a mom who was a Democrat and a dad who was a Republican, a mom who was a Nupiaq, and a father who was Scandinavian. We talk about how she got into politics, including her experience as a legislative staffer that got her wrapped up in the Vic Kohring scandal, before she ran for office herself as a Republican who represented the Abbott Loop area of Anchorage for 10 years. Today, she is the executive director of the Public Safety Employees Association. Charisse Millett, welcome to the podcast.
Hi, it's good to see you.
Tell us about your childhood.
I was born in Juneau. My mom was born in the same hospital. My mom grew up in Nome, Alaska. She lived in White Mountain. My grandma was a full Nupiaq Eskimo. So she came from up north. My grandma married a miner, and he worked on a dredge in Juneau, and then they moved to Fairbanks, where my grandma felt more comfortable. Traveled back and forth to jobs as they came open. So it just happened that he was in Juneau when my mom was born at St. Anne's Hospital. And fast forward, my mom married my dad, who was a electronics technician for the Federal Aviation Administration. So he installed AWAS and navigation aids. So he actually took a job in Annette Island. And so while my mom was pregnant, they moved to Juneau because there was a hospital. So I was born in the same hospital as my mom in St. Anne's. So I have two brothers. One passed away in 2018, and my other brother lives down in Tacoma. I've been married twice, not good at it, not my favorite thing. But out of that, I have three beautiful children, all grown. I've moved into the phase where I don't have any children at home, and my babies are having babies. So I'm blessed with 6 grandbabies, and they all live in Alaska. So I see the ones in Anchorage probably every other day.
Speaking of Anchorage, you graduated from Diamond High School.
I did. So my dad got transferred to Anchorage. And so we lived in Anchorage, but my childhood was amazing because my dad had jobs all over the state of Alaska. I spent one whole summer out in Kodiak it was called Woody Island, just me and my brothers and some FAA housing. But I went to Sand Lake and then Gladyswood and then Mears and then Diamond. And my children did the same exact thing, went to Sand Lake, Mears and Diamond. So I graduated in 1981 and then went to UAA. Here in Anchorage, when back then it was called Anchorage Community College, and then to UAA. So, yeah.
Were your parents political people?
Not really. I didn't know my parents' politics till I was a little bit older. I knew my mom was a Democrat and still is. She believes in the Democratic Party. And my dad learned later that he was a Republican. So that's why I didn't hear a lot about politics. It just...
Because it was a mixed marriage.
It was a mixed marriage. And other than they emphasized voting, it was very important to my mom and it was very important to my dad that everybody voted when I turned 18. I had to vote.
So you turned 18 after the 1980 election.
So my very first campaign that I worked on
84.
was I worked as a young girl. I think I was probably 16 on Reagan's campaign. And only because I had a political science teacher at Diamond that said that we should get involved in that stuff. So I stuffed envelopes and it was very light.
Your dad was a Reagan supporter?
My dad was a Reagan supporter.
I guess... with a mom who was a Democrat and a dad who's Republican, you obviously followed your dad's line of politics more than your mom's.
I did. And we grew up with devout Catholics. My mom and dad were both very devout Catholics. So I grew up in the church. It's funny looking back at who I am now and thinking about my politics. I think I fell into the Republican Party because I think Reagan was just easy to follow. He was very engaging, very charismatic. And he was my first president that I knew of So I think I fell into that. But I also feel like from my mom's side, I had a foot in both worlds. I had a foot in the white world, and I also had a foot in the Native world because all my family on my mom's side was Native. So I understood very clearly the things that my relatives were going through in rural Alaska. I had an uncle that lived in Healy. I had family that lived up in Nome. And my grandma, I stayed with her every summer until she passed she passed when I was 18. So my summers were spent up in Fairbanks with my Eskimo grandma, is what I called her. And all of her friends were Native, and rich cultural experiences with her. She would often eat dry fish and seal oil for lunch. I got exposed to all of those things that I didn't get exposed to in Anchorage. So it was a really unique experience because I knew I was different. So when I found myself in the legislature, I really gravitated towards a lot of Native politics just because I had listened to my mom went to Mount Edgecombe. My grandma went to Chemawa in Oregon. So I understood talking to my grandma, being shipped away to Chemawa in a boarding school as a Native girl, just the kind of things that she endured. It wasn't as bad at Mount Edgecombe for my mom in the late 40s, but it was definitely a different way of upbringing where you leave your family, you leave your village, and you go to a boarding school. And Chemawa was not a very pleasant place, I don't think, for folks that went there. So I got a very interesting background as far as the culture that I carried as a person that's a quarter Native. And so it stayed with me throughout my life.
Did your friends in high school, did everyone know you were Alaska Native?
They did. It did. And back in the 70s and 80s, you got made fun of. They didn't have the Native Cultural Club back then. They had a very small group. And kids would tease you, and it was almost you felt shame, which I'm so glad it's not that way any longer. But yeah, I got called names that I didn't understand, and I'd have to go home and ask my parents what they meant. Mm-hmm. And so there was a little bit of bias, but I don't know if I just overlooked it or just put it behind me because I ran track, I was a cheerleader, I did all those things because I was interested in them, and I was incredibly social as a last child of 3, very gregarious, and liked people and wanted to make friends. And so I did all those things and had a great experience in high school. There was those moments in time when people would talk about me being Native, and some of my friends, they were great about it, but some people in high school, just probably from homes that didn't understand culture, were not as nice.
Did your brothers look out for you?
Oh, my brothers were my biggest defenders. Literally could not date when my brothers were living at the house. And when my brother went off to college, my middle brother who passed, he was very protective. He took on the role of, I want to know who you're dating. I want to know who you're talking to. I want to know who your friends are. Total old school like my dad.
So you worked on that Reagan campaign when you were 16.
Mm-hmm.
And do you feel like the politics bug bit you then, or?
Nope. Actually, I don't think it really did. I think it really started with me when I was in my mid-30s.
Yeah. And you worked for the airline industry.
I did. Yeah. Yep. I started way back when I was 14 or 15 in a company called AI, Alaska Aeronautical Inc. And then I worked for every failing airline since then. But I worked for Revolution Airways. I was there for 12 years. I was a flight attendant. And then from there, I went to ERA and worked mid-management and ran our Twin Otter base out of Bethel. So I spent a lot of time in Bethel, a lot of time in Iliamna, and then also did the government affairs with my boss at the time, a guy I went to high school with, Michael Norman. And he got me involved in the state chamber and the Juneau fly-ins. And so I started that in my mid-30s. And that's when I started getting the interest. And then when I bought my second home, we built it, and we had a lot of drainage problems, and it was out in the Abbott Loop area. So I got involved in the Abbott Loop Community Council and stayed on there as vice chair for 12 years with Al Tamani.
And that's where you met.
And that's where I met Kevin Meyer. Mm-hmm. And Kevin was pushing me like, you need to go down on a Juneau to see if it's something you want to do. I interviewed with a couple of different legislators. I interviewed with Norm Rokeberg. I interviewed with Vic Kohring. I interviewed, I believe it was John Coghill or Pete Cott. I can't remember which one. But Vic needed a chief of staff, and the money was really good. And I was going to be leaving my job, and I would be spending time in Juneau. I still had Zane at home, and he was about 14. I was really concerned about finances. And so I did. I went down and I took the chief of staff job with Vic. And boy, it was like...
You went from having worked in the building to being a chief of staff?
And being chief of staff, I think I was 38 or 39. So I didn't fit in anywhere. So there was a young group
Lots
of
of young
staffers right
yeah.
out of college. And then there was a group of older people that had been staffers for a long time. So I went from having people like Reneva Moss and Janet Seitz to having young people like Ryan McKinster, Miles Baker, Suzanne Cunningham, Tom Wright. So I had this diversion of people. I didn't really fit in anywhere. And luckily I had some people take me under their wing. Fish Pulaski took me under his wing. I had a lobbyist, Michael Hurley, because Vic did oil and gas. He took me under his wing.
You mentioned that. I'm not an expert on this particular phase of the legislature, but Vic Kohring was involved in VACO.
So he was the chair of oil and gas. And when Vic was a legislator, he had a heart of gold. I believe he was very socially awkward. He was a righteous, no tax Republican. Nothing could have changed Vic's mind. But I think he also had a social awkwardness that people being friendly to Vic provided him a friendship, whether it was true or false friendship, right? Whether people were taking advantage of him or not. I saw him really as a young kid that wanted to be accepted and wanted to be liked, but his politics were solid. That's just who Vic was. So I think there was a part of Vic that liked the lobbyist attention. And I think falling into the VICO scandal and falling into that, I had left right about the time that all started happening. Mind you, I saw the lobbyists come in and out of the office. Vic didn't share a lot of that, but I knew he had dinners. I knew what his reputation was.
So you feel like he was vulnerable because he didn't have a lot of friends and he was socially awkward, and the lobbyists were coming in and paying him attention and being nice to him. And
I also think they were giving him information, but because he did chair the oil and gas committee. But I don't think all the lobbyists were taking advantage of him. I think that Vic misread the attention as being a chair of a committee and being a legislator and going out to dinner with lobbyists and people that were in the oil and gas industry. In his head, I don't think it was a perceived conflict. And I think that's the unfortunate thing about Vic, because he had the kindest heart, the biggest heart. He married a gal, kind of sight unseen, a Russian gal, and she had a daughter. And I watched Vic just grow attached to this daughter, and he would spend evenings reading her books over the phone. He bought his wife a house in Oregon. I saw all that transpire while I was working for him. Like any human, he wanted to be loved and accepted. And I also think he didn't know the line, which as a legislator he should have. So I watched that, and there was a lot of times I would tell Vic, you can't do that. Vic, there's things that you can't do, and try
like in terms of
accepting gifts, or just we should get an ethics opinion on that. So I got to know Joyce Anderson very well when I worked for Vic. Also, I knew right from wrong. And as I matured in that position, I was there with him for one full session and half a session. It broke my heart to watch this. I left Vic's office and went to work for Scott Nordstrand over at Department of Administration. He was a commissioner then, and worked as a legislative information officer, public information officer, and the legislative liaison. So I had two jobs into one, which I spent, and that was Governor Murkowski. Unfortunately, Scott had to take a leave of absence. So I ended up sitting in for Commissioner Nordstrand. As a commissioner? Not as a commissioner, but as commissioner meetings.
Gotcha.
And so got to know Cheryl Frasca, got to know the whole committee, or the whole commissioner group that Governor Murkowski had, and learned a ton about DOA. I ended up going to work that summer in the following session for Speaker John Harris. Yeah. He hired me knowing that I wanted to file for office. I worked as a staffer under Tom Wright. And as that session started, that's when the investigation started happening. I got my first call from FBI, met with an agent from Las Vegas that was investigating that. Ended up getting a very interesting call from Jim Pound, who took over as chief of staff that interim. And Jim was asking me where the oil and gas files were. And as a committee aide, you take the oil and gas.
Kohring's office?
And in Kohring's office. And I said, I sent them all over to the library, as you did. They were all paper files back then.
Right.
And so I said, I sent them over, and they said, oh, the library said they never got them. And to me, I was like, I know I did. You box them up, you put them in banker's box during the end of session, you send them over. There's someone that comes from LAA and takes them over. I knew that the boxes were sent there. What I didn't know is the FBI had intercepted all those boxes. And then Jim said, and by the way, they confiscated all of our computers in Vic's office. And so when I got the call from the gal from Las Vegas with FBI, I was dumbfounded, right? And she was like, we want to interview you. We want to talk to you about all this stuff. And I'm thinking in my head, I really want to run for office someday. Like, I've worked for Vic. What's going to happen? And I remember there was a day that session had started and I was working for Speaker Harris, and Speaker Harris called me and said, hey, can you come into the office? And I said, yeah. He said, the FBI's here. They're looking for Vic. Do you happen to know where he is? And when I was his chief of staff, he didn't have a car, so he let me park my car in his parking spot. And I always let him borrow my car if he needed to go to the laundromat or whatever. But he often took my car out to St. Teresa Shrine, where I always went because of Catholic. And it was just a great, peaceful place.
Beautiful.
Beautiful. So anyway, that's where they found him and arrested him. And everything transpired. That interim, before I filed, I took a family vacation with my daughter and we went over to Hawaii. And while I was over in Hawaii, I got subpoenaed to testify. And I was like, oh my gosh, I'm in Hawaii. I've got my grandkids and my son-in-law. And I called Joyce Anderson at the time. She was at ethics. I was like, what do I do? Crazy enough, Joyce was in Hawaii at the time, got the same subpoena.
Wow.
And so her and I talked for a little bit, and I was required to buy my own ticket back home. And so I was getting ready to do all that. And the next day, Vic had taken a plea agreement. And so
you
didn't have to go to trial. But it was really interesting. And that all happened.
And did he go to prison?
He did. He went to prison. And I didn't keep in touch with him. After he got out of prison, he contacted me. And he was such a soft-hearted human. And he was very kind. While I worked for him, I got diagnosed with cancer. He allowed me to work down in Seattle while I had my treatments I was down there for 12 weeks. I took my laptop and my phone down. And when I had to live down in Seattle while my treatment.
You're cancer-free now?
I'm cancer-free, yeah. 22 years. Yeah.
Oh, thank goodness.
But so he always had a soft spot because he allowed me to do that. I would have survived. I don't know how people do it when they have to lose their jobs when they have cancer. I had cancer in my salivary gland that went back towards my brainstem, and had it resected, and then went and had neutron radiation, which is at the time, or still experimental treatment. Fortunate, had insurance and my native health benefits. But yeah, so I always had a soft spot in my heart for Vic because he allowed me to do that. And I was capable of working. It was just the treatments were not offered up here.
As a new legislator, when I hear this story of the files that you're sending out, you're assuming they're ending up at the library, the FBI is intercepting them, they're taking your computers, your laptops. It's good for me to hear this story to be like, I should probably care.
Yeah. And those little things that the FBI wanted to know about Vic, and he was so boyish. He had, I think probably people have heard of this before, but he had this thing called the red carpet list. And on the red carpet list were all the people that we could interrupt him
at
meetings
any
time if they came in the door. And obviously it was all legislators, but there were other people that were on it. We had some friends from the Valley. He had lobbyists that.
Yeah. Where did Vic represent?
So he was from Wasilla.
Okay.
And there was questions like that they asked, and that I clearly remember. And so does the other staff that we all worked together. There was a gal named Denise that lived down the Valley, and then Pam Marquez, worked in the office. Dave Savadny worked in the office, and both of Dave's dad and Pam's husband was the attorney general. And we were all very concerned about what was happening. But it was definitely one of the more unusual things that have happened in my life. Worked for John, and then Cowdery got mixed up in that FBI investigation.
Did you have a good relationship with Cowdery?
I did. I really liked John. Again, old school legislator. I loved his wife dearly. She was in the office a lot. I didn't know what he did day to day. I didn't know about, until the FBI investigation came out. There was a lot of people down there. I think they named them the Corrupt Bastards Club when I was down there, and that name stuck with a lot of legislators that were doing oil and gas legislation at the time. And I think it was unfairly gifted to a lot of people that had no ties to any of that. But I really was questioning whether I should run for office because I didn't know if that would reflect poorly on me. Yeah. And so when John got indicted, Kevin ran for Cowdery's seat, and Kevin said, "You need to run. you need to run. And I was very concerned about the optics of
Because Cowdery was senator at that time, and Kevin ran for that. And so then the seat was open for
the
you to
seat
run.
was open. Yep. And so I did it. I went in and cashed in some bonds that I had. I made 6 months of my house payment and paid off my car because I didn't want my husband at the time to fear that I'm going to be without money. Gave myself a 6-month window, and my kids were very excited. It was my mom's running for office.
Your youngest was?
So my youngest at that time was probably, he might have been 15, 16, yeah. And my other two were heading off to college. So that was what was...
Maybe if teenagers are more excited about it, I'll just say I had a 9-year-old who it was not fun for him. I was putting up some door hangers in some mobile home parks, and I was like, want to go hang up some literature? And he was like, no, like just so angry.
Don't get me wrong. My Zane would go, but it was like pulling teeth. He was really into comp hockey, so we had to manage his hockey schedule and had to manage my campaign. But Ryan McKinster, Jeff Turner came and volunteered on my campaign, and I really had no clue, or I had at the time been in as district chair for the Republican Party and had been there probably 2 or 3 years and understood the politics a little bit. Had no idea what it was going to be like as a female running for office, because I will tell you, and I'm sure if you talk to Senator McGuire and talk to some of the other female legislators that ran for office, there was a lot of men that were not as keen on female running, maybe some of the head people of the Republican Party.
I was going to say, I don't want to make a gross stereotype, but I would say that it's still that way in the Republican caucus in the House. There's fewer women, and I don't want to speak for them, but I think that they are very conscious.
Yeah. And I think it's good to be conscious of that. So I had a couple mentors when I started. Senator Murkowski was one of my favorite mentors, and Senator McGuire was a mentor. And they would give me great advice. Senator Murkowski told me, if you're going to be a legislator, this is just the way of the world. These are the facts. You're going to have to know the subjects better than any of your colleagues, men or women. You're going to have to be a subject matter expert. You're going to have things that are going to happen that aren't going to happen to men, but you don't react. These are sage advice that sometimes I didn't take in my first couple of years. Liesl talked about how they'll demean you, and there'll be whisper campaigns about you and whatever you're doing, and you're drinking too much, or at a bar too much, or you're seen with so-and-so. All of that is, I probably still holds true now, I would assume. I don't know. I haven't talked to any of the sitting legislators, but I would hope that has all least gotten better, especially with the things that were happening with the Me Too movement. But so I ran for office.
Were your parents supportive?
So my dad passed away in 2000. So unfortunately, he was my biggest cheerleader. My mom was really excited. She was not as excited that I wasn't running as a Democrat, but my mom is the most supportive woman. She's still alive. I talk to her every day. My mom is very supportive.
Is she in Anchorage?
She's in Anchorage. Of course, she ribbed me a little bit.
Well, my mom's a Republican. It's embarrassing for her that I'm a Democrat.
Oh, so I don't think it was embarrassing for my mom, but very excited about election night. My kids were all home, very excited. We were all excited to go down to the Egan Center because back then that was a thing. You had your entourage go out and you carried your signs, and it was way different than it is now. And they were all just hyped to go. And as the precincts came in,
who was your challenger?
So it was this very nice man named Bruce Webb. He's just such a good guy. I really liked him. It wasn't like we were
enemies
at each other's throats. And so the precincts, I won a couple, he won a couple. I was very sad that night. I didn't know what I had done. I had quit my career.
Yeah, you thought you'd lost.
In the beginning, I thought I was losing, and it was sad. I was like, I'm not going down to Egan Center because this is embarrassing. And at the time,
in here. Do you, for our listeners, how I met Charisse? I met you on Jeff Landfield's Landmine live election night coverage, where I had to see my first precinct come in.
I remember
where I was losing, and I'll just say, talk about the worst way to get your first precinct and where you're losing is you're live on
the air and really having to pretend like you're okay.
How does that feel? Or whatever. And I'm like, oh my God.
I actually think we read your precinct results as we were interviewing you. And I was like,
oh, I know this feeling. It's so awful. You have to keep a...
You're like, oh, there's more votes to be counted.
It's okay.
I had my campaign manager was like sitting over there, like, more votes to be counted. I was like, there's more votes to be counted.
And it's like nobody teaches you how to accept defeat or how to accept winning either, right? There's no handbook like, okay, if this happens, hopefully you surround yourself with people that know that can hold you up.
And I don't know about you, but see, for me, everyone had told me that I was going to win.
Oh, me too.
And so
Kevin Meyer endorsed me. I was a shoo-in.
To be on the air and have it come in that you're losing, you're like, oh my God, I have misjudged all of this.
I know, and I'm texting Kevin at the time. I'm texting him like, I'm not winning. There's lots of precincts, Charisse, you're fine. And of course, he's like landslide winning the district, right? And I'm over here like inching.
Yes.
We ended up not going down to Egan Center because I didn't know, and went to bed that night and I was up like 40 votes. And in the morning, I had won the primary by 64 votes. Whew. Every vote counts.
Yes.
Yeah.
So you got sworn in 2009?
I got sworn in 2009.
And then Mike Chenault was the
Chenault was the speaker. We elected him speaker.
And we're Republican caucus.
Republican caucus. Mm-hmm. First group was great. I had another mentor, Ralph Samuels, at the time, told me, your first year in the legislature, this is what you do. You sit down, keep your mouth shut, figure out what lower committee you want, and get the votes for it and move on. But don't talk on the floor. If you're going to introduce bills, make sure they're going to pass. They're good subjects. Softball yourself your first year. You can still be effective. But so ACES had passed maybe 2 years before. Mm-hmm. Of course, there wasn't a session that we didn't have an oil and gas tax bill. And so luckily I'd worked on the oil and gas committee and really knew the subject well, had heard ACES in committee. I had luckily had that experience of sitting in committees and learning about stuff. I knew the process pretty well. I had worked in the administration.
Y'all had so much money.
We did have money then, but you have to remember, oil went down $9 a barrel also during that time. First session, money. Second session, no money. Third session, no money. So under ACES, tons of money, right? Then we passed SB 21 when I was in the legislature. Oil dropped. We went into this whole horrible kind of cyclical thing that you do now. Right?
Basically, like you were the last era of
money.
Big budget. Too much money.
The point where when we would sit down and talk about the capital budget, it was by district, how much money you were getting by district, right? Okay, of just your own little
whatever projects you have.
Yeah, or whatever you wanted. Luckily, Kevin was co-chair, who's a finance guy, and so we always had it stacked, right? We had roads that need to be done. We really, I will say, Kevin really focused on infrastructure capital budget projects. There wasn't a lot of fluff in our district to be had.
But you left the caucus.
So that was my second term. I will say I was a little immature about that during caucus, and I mea culpa all the time, apologize to my constituents. At the time, my cocker had cancer, and he was in our caucus, but he was getting treatment, so he was out of town. Nobody had told me that they wanted to be ledge council chair. So then that second organization, we had a couple of new people. I remember I was sitting next to Mia, and Anna Fairclough was in my caucus, and Nancy Dahlstrom was in my caucus. And they were all like, yep, ledge council, if that's what you want, we'll all support you. Little did I know that my cocker, that's what he wanted. And it was appropriate for him to do that because when he was coming back, it was a one committee caucus. He didn't sit on any other committees. It was perfect for someone who
had been out
and wasn't recovering. And I don't know if my heart just iced over or what was going on in my mind.
But you had been told that people supported you, and you thought
we had 3 rounds of votes. Right. And so when we went through the first round of votes in caucus and organization, we split. And at that point, I should have acquiesced because he had been in there a long time. And I've matured a lot since then because it was humiliating and it was something I did to myself. And so the second round came, we were tied and we break up. And then someone flipped, and I'm not sure who it was because, it's all done by secret ballot in there. And he won, and I was mad. I was upset. I was hurt. I thought, how can I be with people because no one has come forward to say they're going to change their vote. Because it took it too personal because politics should not be that personal. And there was other opportunities for me to do something different. And I chose the easy way out. And
you went to a caucus of 1? Like you just went off in caucus?
Went to a caucus 1 right after that. Kyle Johansson was upset about all that things that had happened when we were good friends.
Oh, so you're a caucus of 2.
No, we never formed a caucus.
Oh.
No, they called us the Love Caucus because everybody thought that we were the great romantic couple. We had both gone through a divorce, and it was easy to assume, I'm sure, because we hung out a lot. But he got mad and left, and it didn't fly very well for him in Ketchikan. I came back to Anchorage and apologized immediately and said that I would do whatever I could. And unfortunately, I think Ketchikan was not.
So
they're very
that cost
judgmental.
him. Yeah.
It did, and people treated him really poorly. There are 2 things in my life I would take back. Right, I would take back my immaturity during that caucus, and I would take back a vote I had on the floor, which I think I've told you about before.
What was the vote on the floor?
The vote on the floor was to censure David Eastman when he made the insensitive comments about
Alaska Native women.
Yeah, Alaska Native women. And that was a vote as the minority leader. I felt I had to support my caucus member, but as a Native woman, it deeply,
So
profoundly
you
hurt
voted
me.
no for the censure, but
I
you wish
did.
you voted yeah.
He got censured. He got censured.
He got censured that
Yeah.
time, and then he got censured again.
Yeah, and I think the minority leader, you have this responsibility to uphold your members and to fight for them, which I did my minority leader job, but it felt very torn as far as my heritage and my culture and my friends and my family. I thought about what my grandmother would think.
Right.
There are tough decisions. People don't understand about leadership is there's moments like that touch you in a way that you have these 2 decisions to make. I wouldn't have been much of a minority leader if I didn't support right, wrong, or indifferent what Representative Eastman did. But also there was this torn part of me that was like, it changed me fundamentally. Like, how can I give up on my culture and not represent my cultural side of it? It was a really
Did you hear from
heart-wrenching.
folks?
I did. Absolutely I did. Yeah. A lot of folks in AFN were very upset with me, rightly so. There was a lot of backlash for me personally, not politically, but personally. It really did. And it messed with my head for a long time. To this day, I still think about that on the floor when I got up to, I didn't defend Representative Eastman. I just told everybody how torn I was and told how Representative Eastman had apologized at that point. And I talked about things I learned in being a Catholic, about forgiveness and about second chances. I had all that prepared, and everything I said, I absolutely still believe, but it's one of those votes where I cried. I went home and cried. I still think about it and it gets me messed up. Yeah. So maybe that vote, probably, I think I would have rather have censured and maybe not been the minority leader. I don't know. Hindsight's 2020, but I know that one really stuck with me and will always stick with me. And also leaving the caucus stuck with me because I immediately, when I got home, I realized how immature and how I had let down my constituents and how I thought immediately driving home, and God bless Representative Chenault, he called me and he said, come back. And I was like, at this point, I can't. And I had great supporters that were in the caucus that didn't hate me, but understood. And they saw what happened. And luckily at that point, Senator Murkowski, I called her and asked her, what should I do? And she said, pick a subject that's nonpartisan. There's some stuff out there that you've been working on. And so I did. I picked what they're called now orphan wells, which we called them back then legacy wells. There was 137 wells that hadn't been plugged properly by the federal government. So it was a National Petroleum Reserve. They did naval experiments out there. They did all sorts of drilling out there, experimental drillings, and they just didn't work. And they didn't cap the wells off well, or the caps fell off. It was detrimental to the environment, but at the same time, the federal government was putting these really horrible restrictions on drilling in the Arctic, where we have an EPA in America. Other places that were drilling had no regulations and are the biggest polluters in the world. So the irony was not lost on me that we have this environmental disaster and then we have this environmental crusade to stop drilling, but yet they're not looking over here at the history of our own federal government, who did not take care of the lands very well. It became a really hot button issue. It became nationally newsworthy. So we passed a resolution. It was bipartisan. I will tell you, the Republicans in that caucus were super supportive of that. I kept my head down. I worked my rear end off. I made amends, apologized to my caucus members because it was humiliating for all Republicans that I did that. It wasn't just a reflection of my poor choices. So that second term, I was, out of caucus. I think I sat on judiciary that year. That was my only one committee. I had one staff, and
so they punished you.
I had one committee. I didn't really need,
but
I didn't
staff.
need I didn't need staff. Like really, I had one committee, so I could do a lot of my own constituent work.
Right.
And I think when you only have one committee, let's be honest. I mean, I'm not into government waste. I could make my own constituent calls. I can answer my own emails. I had a committee aide that helped me with committee bills and did my own personal bills. But I had one committee.
So you were a majority leader, you were a minority leader, 10 years in the House. And then you got defeated in 2018 in the Republican primary by Josh Revak.
I did.
Can you talk about that?
Yeah. Let me tell you about my Recovery Act, though. So I went down and testified on that legacy well bill. It became I became a uniter in my caucus. The next go around, I was back in the caucus. I ended up getting the co-chair of energy with Bryce Edgman. The following year, I became a majority leader. So I had earned back the trust of my caucus.
And then some. Yep.
Yeah, right. So fast forward, when I was majority leader, Chris Tuck was minority leader. And I will tell you, I worked so well with Chris. He is definitely a uniter. And I don't think I could have been majority leader without a minority leader like Chris. We had a great session. Things went well. Internally inside the Republican caucus, there was some turmoil going on. There were some folks that were unhappy with the way the budgeting was working and the capital projects and some of the bills that hadn't been heard, and rightly so. We were a super majority. Maybe we were just a high majority. We had 27. So anyway, next session, we were in the minority. And so I got elected for my minority as minority leader, and Chenault was the minority whip, which was crazy because he had been my speaker forever. So anyway, we had a great session. None of us in the Republican caucus had ever been in the minority. It would have been like years, decades probably. So it was a whole new experience being the minority leader in a bunch of Republicans. And David Eastman was elected that year, and that was the year of Trump. And so things
2016.
Things got more polarized, and it was a tough year. Great Republican caucus. We were 18 strong.
That's a big minority.
It was a big minority, and the coalition had 22. So we did have to work together, and we did ultimately find a way to work together. There was some roadblocks, but Bryce is a consummate professional. When I was minority leader, the Trump thing happened. And so I was up for my seat. I had Josh file against me. He called me up and I said, what am I doing wrong? What am I doing wrong? Oh, you're not doing anything wrong. I just feel I've been called to run for office. You're not.
Like he felt like a call from God?
No, I don't. It was just a calling. I didn't ask him where it was from. And I think some people do have that calling to run for office. I respect it. Same. So no disrespect to Josh, and he had every right to run. And then my frenemy is Jeff Lamfield. Now we're great friends, but we actually laughed about this, and he's really going to give me hard time because I'm doing your podcast before his podcast, because we've been trying to do his podcast for a long time. They formed an IE against me, and I wasn't a big Trump supporter. I think that I had made Jeff upset a couple times when I was majority leader and wouldn't give him the excused absence list or why they were gone. And that's just none of anybody's business. It's an HR thing. If you're absent from the floor, you're absent for your reasons, and you have your constituents to answer to, right? And to speculate where people were was not, I just wasn't in the cards. And so I'm sure I upset him. And so anyway, they formed an IE against me. I wrote a Facebook thing was disappointed in how Trump talked about women. And I think Lisa Murkowski did. And I think Liesl did. I think a bunch of us got together and not for.
Oh, that's interesting. So their IE was basically attacking you for not supporting Trump?
Yeah. And I think they talked a lot about my travel. But again, being majority leader and being minority leader and being involved in the energy sector, I had gotten chosen to CSG to be a toll fellow. I was part of the Energy Council, and so travel was an issue, and they called me a partier and whatever. You just pick whatever wound you can find, and something's going to stick to the wall. I'm sure more than anything in that Republican district, it was the Facebook post about I was disappointed in Trump and how he talked about women, and so be it. Didn't say I hated his policies. I just said that we hold our politicians to a better standard. And then there was this incident at the White House.
What's the incident in the White House?
The incident at the White House is, you're going to love this. This is the best ever. I had gone, Senator Murkowski and I are good friends, and she had invited me down to the White House Christmas party one year. And I went, and it was a great honor to go in there. At the time, President Obama, and there was Vice President Joe Biden. Joe Biden is a very gregarious person at the time. He was at the party, and Senator Murkowski was introducing me to Vice President Joe Biden. And she said, if she's Native, she's Inupiaq, she's Eskimo. And he was like, oh, I've never met a Native Alaskan woman, and, yada, yada, yada. He was like, is it true that Eskimos kiss with their nose? And Senator Murkowski started laughing. Is there's a thing called Eskimo kiss in Alaska. And I was like, yeah. And I'm teaching him about my culture, and I'm teaching him about my mom's side of the family and how beautiful our culture is, and the indigenous foods we eat, and berry picking and hunting and fishing. He was like, oh, what's an Eskimo kiss? And so I said, it's where two people rub noses. And so anyway, so there's a picture of me Eskimo kissing Joe Biden. And at the time it was funny, and it was very lighthearted, and it was an opportunity for me to share Alaska. I had his undivided attention for 20 minutes.
They used that picture?
They did. And I got beat up pretty bad. I'm not going to lie. When I got back, radio hosts beat me up, Republican radio hosts beat me up about it. Compared it to the blue dress moment with Clinton. I'm like, okay, first off.
Oh my
Yeah,
God.
It was ridiculous. It was ridiculous how much trouble I got in with the party for that. And I, as a legislator, was thinking, look, I'm at the White House Christmas party. I'm meeting the vice president, and I have an opportunity to share with him about Alaska. And anyway, yeah. So
but it worked.
It worked.
And Josh won
the Trump thing, the Biden thing.
I wonder now,
but I was also
hope in primaries if you would have prevailed.
I don't know. But I was gone for a month. And during that primary, my brother was down in Kentucky trying to get custody of his daughter, and had been clean for quite a while. And he fell into the wrong crowd when we went back there. And he had a brainstem aneurysm, and my whole family flew down, and he was in a coma. And so I was gone for a month, taking care of my brother.
During the campaign,
my brother passed on June 30th. I stayed down there another week, helping my mom get custody of his daughter and bring her back to Alaska. I was closest to him, and his death hit me really hard. He struggled with addiction his whole life, and I loved him greatly. He was my protector, my best friend. And so when August, 16th came around, I just lost my brother. I had been gone for a month. All these things were going on. My campaign had tried to do all this stuff, but I wasn't back. I wasn't doing town halls. I wasn't door-to-dooring. Life showed me that there was something more important. So when I lost, I was gracious. I called Josh, told him whatever you need. You can do whatever you want. I conceded right away. My biggest concern at that point was I had incredible staff. My staff came over, and it was hard. Grace Irvine was my chief of staff. Jeff Turner worked for me at the time. Ike Geolopsis had been in my office but had moved on. I had people in my district that counted on me to win, and I didn't. We had my brother's funeral right after that because we were waiting for that to get over, which kind of bugged me that my campaign was getting in the way of this grieving process. God gave me, I truly believe there was divine intervention, that my brother passing made me realize that politics was not the end game for me, and that things were happening in my life that I needed to be closer to, taking care of my mom, watching my grandchildren, being there for my kids. So I think while other people that lose, that don't have that perspective, it's an end of a career. For me, it was almost as like shackles had been taken off of me, and
you were free.
I could breathe. I could spend time with my kids. I had no idea what I was going to do for a job, but I had till January to figure that out, and had time to help get custody of my niece and bring her back to Alaska. So all these things that were real life things, real family, and things that I needed to pay attention to, I was allowed to do that. And the legislature was not going to be the career path for me. Great 10 years, best job, but it was not where I was meant to be.
So you're the executive director of PSAE?
Public
PSEA.
Safety Employees Association.
Public
Yep.
Safety Employees
Yep.
Association. I always get the
Yep.
letters out of order.
And in probably my last 8 years, I started doing a lot of legislation for public safety. I did an 8-year military buyback for people that went into law enforcement. I did the line of death benefit bill. I did a lot of those. My son went to school with Bree Moore.
Breeze Law.
Bree's Law. She was a classmate of Zane's, and that was really personal to me and to Zane, getting Bree's Law passed. So I did a lot of really good things and a lot of public safety things.
With certain Anchorage legislators, they're all about their tiny little district in the middle of Anchorage. But I think because you were born in Juneau, you spent all this time traveling all over the state, that you really were a legislator for the state of Alaska.
Yeah, I did. And I think that's a perspective that as an Anchorage legislator, you're kind of isolated here. And it was interesting because Kevin had done so much for our district. We were a well-oiled machine per se. And so we had a more global approach to Alaska. Even Kevin did. And so I got to do cultural things, the Indigenous language bill that JKT and I did together. We did some really incredible things in the legislature.
Do you speak Inupiat?
I don't. And that was the reason I wanted that bill passed so bad, is because that language was lost when my grandma passed. I heard her speak it, and she spoke it fluently. And I knew certain words, but no one ever taught me.
Your mom doesn't speak it.
My mom doesn't speak it. So that language bill was really important to me, because losing your language is losing your identity. So when JKT came to me and said, can we do this together? I was like, absolutely. This is brilliant. I did some ICWA legislation for adoption of Native children. And I did that with AFN. And that was really moving and special. It's now the model for foster children all over the United States. It's not just isolated. That policy and program works. So I was really fortunate to be involved with some pretty great stuff. So I'm super proud of what I did.
It's 2024. It's an election year. It feels stressful watching national politics. Even state politics right now is very strained and stressful. I don't know. What's your perspective?
I don't know. I had a legislator, Robin Taylor, lived across the street from me one session. And I was talking to him, and he served a long time. Rick Halford I ran into down in Juneau, and I'd talked to him quite a bit about politics. And I almost think it's a pendulum swing, as far as it gets very combative and then it goes back to neutral. And then I think we ran through this when Ron Paul ran for president. I think you see it in certain times of who's running or what the Republican Party is thinking about or what the Democrat Party is thinking about. We saw it during Obamacare. I don't know. I hope it's not the new way of politics.
Were you a Nikki Haley person?
I was a Nikki Haley person. I was, there's a bunch of us that were. And unfortunately, that's not going to happen. But what my hope is for the legislature, and this is, I will tell you this, you need to be able to walk into anybody's office, and you need to have relationships with people you don't agree with. I had an incredible relationship with Les Guerra. Les Guerra and I talked all the time. I agree with him on his foster care. I wanted that for him because he'd worked so hard for it. I had incredible relationships with Beth Kurtula. Andy Josephson and I worked on SB 91 to make it not pass together. Think about these relationships. And Matt Clayman and I sat on judiciary for a long time. Max Gruenberg, I respected greatly, sat on judiciary with these people. So I don't see that it's okay anymore to have those bipartisan relationships. And it bothers me. You don't have to agree with your political foe.
I'd say it's a little different now. Two of my best friends in the legislature are Republicans.
Right.
So and they know it.
But we openly shared dinners together. We openly went out together. We went
when you talk
running
about the
together.
picture of you with Biden, they're not a freshman, but there's a seasoned legislator in the House right now who said, and I won't reveal their gender, they said that they absolutely can never be photographed with a Democrat. Like it would destroy them in their district.
He was the sitting vice president. There is honor in that office.
Right. But so what I'm saying, though, is that that's still a message that's being communicated in the House by some folks saying that they can't be photographed with a member of the other party. That person is friendly one-on-one.
Right.
If there's no, if
Right.
you're, but
But
they're not out in public.
But so I can understand that only in the fact that Biden picture came back in my campaign. And so people are cautious, right? They're cautious about what your opponent will use against you.
This is my idea. I think we talk about all the things that we as legislators need to do in terms of getting along. Actually, I want our constituents to do it too. You know what I'm saying?
Oh,
It's one
absolutely.
thing for me to openly have dinner with Republicans. I need my constituents who are Democrats
understand it.
to have dinner with their Republican
think
neighbors. I need my Republican neighbors to have dinner with their Democrat neighbors.
Therein lies the problems with how tightly wound our parties are. Your party and my party, Republican Party and the Democrat Party, right? To the fact that I think Republicans and Democrats almost like to eat their own, that they've got this bar. If you're not Republican enough or you're not Democrat enough, if you aren't conservative enough or you're not liberal enough, you can't be a Republican. And that has evolved. And I watched it evolve. And it's now it's almost that compromise is a dirty word. And compromise has been part of our political system since it was born. You look at who signed the Declaration of Independence. They all didn't get along. They weren't all the same political party.
Hey, I'll go someplace very controversial to end this because I thought about it when you were talking about your mom being a Democrat, your dad being a Republican, both being devout Catholics, because, you know, historically, Nick Begich Sr., Catholic, very opposed to abortion. In Alaska, legalizing abortion, he was the poster child for anti-abortion, and he was the Democrat, and that has really shifted. And when France did their vote, and I looked at that article about France voting this week to put it in their constitution, it said that the abortion prior to 16 weeks. And what I thought a lot about was how we're not able to have any sort of compromise, because I was like, 16 weeks is a compromise position.
Yeah. The test used to be when I first started out in the Republican Party, like Republicans were okay with abortion in the cases of rape or incest, right? They don't believe that anymore. And it's an interesting shift. So I'm Catholic, but like my religion and my personal beliefs are not going to override political decisions. Right. And I'm not going to do that. So it was interesting. Right to Life used to always send me flyers and, are you pro-life? I'm like, I'm Catholic, I'm pro-life. But what I'm going to tell you in my survey is that my personal views and my Catholicism do not step over the line of a constitution or a woman's right to choose. And I know that's really hard for people to understand, that I can compartmentalize that. I have a personal belief, but not everybody shares my personal belief. And I have to legislate for people that aren't Catholics or that don't follow the doctrine of Catholics, right? That's okay. They can be Catholic and be pro-choice. I understand that. I can wrap my head around that because people take religion for what they want it to be. But as far as what we legislate, you legislate for people with all beliefs. And there are people out there that are pro-choice. And you have to respect that. They're not going to go to hell. They're not evil people. They're not awful people. They think different than me. And it's okay to have that. I should be able to sit down and listen to them and what is reasonable. And like you said,
16 weeks.
16 weeks.
I feel like if I were to say, they would be like, are you a Republican?
Here's what I will tell you.
Yeah.
I am a woman. I don't know any woman in the world that wants to face that decision. I don't know any. I don't know any woman that wants to be put in the position where they are pregnant. Either they financially can't handle it, their body can't handle it, the fetus has some type of hereditary disease. I wouldn't wish that on anyone. And no woman wants to be put in that position. And if you don't give someone in that position grace because they believe different than you or they think different than you, and you are a God-fearing Christian, there's something wrong with your God-fearing Christian rights, because no woman wants to be put in that position. No woman. And I think of that often. I have held hands with people that had to be in that choice, that have tremendous guilt with that choice. And it sucked for them. And then to be judged and to be ridiculed and to be called a baby killer and all those things makes me sick as a God-fearing woman. I fear that. Because I'm going to give that person grace. I'm going to pray for that person because they need it. they found themselves in a situation that no one ever wants to be in. And it is really heart-wrenching when I see people condemning other people for life choices that they have no freaking idea about. It's a hard political decision that Republicans make and Democrats make. There has to be some middle room. Mm-hmm. I was in that position. I had my son, but let me tell you, there's women that make the other choice that are just as torn up. And then they have to go out and face a public, a group of people that don't believe the way they believe and called every name in the book. Who wants that?
No one.
We want better for our children and people in the world. And there's no easy answer, but making it a freaking political football and name calling and chastising and all that is unforgivable to me and is the most unchristian thing you can do to someone. And I believe that. I believe that judging another human being and then shaming them because of it is a decision they made and you don't know their circumstances, that's unforgivable.
Thank you so much, Charisse Millett. Thanks so much for being here today.
We ended on such a sour note.
Well, you know what I was going to say? Are you going to come back? You're young enough.
No, I'm not. I'm so happy. I love my job at PSEA. So I represent the state troopers, the CSOs, the deputy fire marshals, the airport police and fire. I've got 8 municipalities. I love the people that serve Alaska that I get to help in my capacity as their association executive director. We have the best police force out there. We are blessed that Alaska supports our public safety group. We consummate professionals. They're great men and women that run into danger for you and I every day. I hear their stories. I hear what they've seen. I've heard what they had to do. They meet a person at their worst moment in time. Nobody wants to call 911, but I'm glad that they respond to those calls, and I love my job. And luckily, everybody loves public safety in Alaska. And so I will retire from this job, and then my only title that I will hold is grandmother and mother.
Thank you so much for your service in the legislature.
Yeah.
Thank you for your work at
your
PSEA.
Yep.
And thank you for being on the podcast.
Yeah, thank you. Good to see you.
Thank you, listeners. If you like what you heard, please subscribe, rate, and review us. To contact me, email rep.andrew.gray@akleg.gov or call 907-465-4940.